Imagine how often in life we notice a curious paradox. As soon as we let go of a situation, it begins to improve. It seems illogical, since we were taught from childhood to actively pursue goals, fight for what is ours, and never give up. But what if the truth lies in a completely different approach? What if it is precisely excessive attachment that becomes the stumbling block that hinders us in relationships, careers, and most importantly, in achieving inner peace? Carl Jung, a prominent psychologist, put forward a concept that may seem unfamiliar. The more we try to control our lives, the further they slip away from us. Today we will explore how letting go can be the key to true freedom. Stay with us, because this new perspective can turn your perception of the world upside down. The tighter we hold on to our ideas of how things should be, the faster the desired outcome eludes us. Attachment, intended to give us a sense of confidence and security, often fails to live up to these hopes. The paradox is that by releasing control, we allow life to breathe fully. As C. Jung said, "What you resist persists. What you look at disappears." In modern society, perseverance, control, and a relentless pursuit of new achievements are valued, as if peace of mind is always somewhere on the horizon. However, it is precisely this obsessive pursuit of control that can become an obstacle to something genuine and meaningful. This is not about giving up or falling into apathy, but about a more subtle art, stepping out of the mode of constant control and entering a state of mindfulness. In his profound explorations of the human psyche, Carl Jung offered us a valuable tool for understanding its workings. Detachment, in his understanding, is not a manifestation of emotional detachment, but rather a necessary psychological maneuver for the ego. The ego must free itself from its projections in order to open the way for the manifestation of something true. In other words, as long as we are absorbed in what we project onto others, whether it be our desires or idealized ideas about the future, we are not able to see the true picture of our inner world. The desire for a favorable outcome is quite natural. However, the problem arises when our self-identification becomes dependent on the result, when our self is defined by success, connections, or recognition. In such a situation, failure, loss, or even the silence of another person is perceived as a threat to one's very existence. This is where fear, anxiety, and desperate attempts to control everything originate. Jung argued that this state of continuous tension is nothing more than an attempt by the ego to maintain illusions. Genuine changes occur when we stop resisting the course of life, not out of defeat, but thanks to newfound clarity. Letting go of the old is not a plunge into the abyss, but rather giving a chance to new events that do not entirely depend on human aspirations. This is a manifestation of faith in a higher power that guides the path of life. When this step is taken from the heart, what seemed chaotic gains logic. Circumstances fall into place harmoniously, prospects open up without being intrusive, and anxieties give way to conscious presence. Thus, letting go is not a rejection of aspirations or an escape from reality. It is, rather, a rejection of imposing one's will, a release from the shackles of "this is how it should be," and an immersion into a state of conscious contemplation. When a person ceases to identify with the object of their aspirations, they approach an understanding of their true essence, and then, without much fuss, life begins to improve. But what if the reason holding a person back is not another person, but the qualities and expectations that they themselves have placed on them? Often, attachment is not just an attraction to another, but a projection of one's own needs and desires. A person may see in another salvation, confirmation of their significance, a role that the other may not have sought to play. As Jung argued, people tend to notice in others, in an idealized or distorted form, what they do not want to admit in themselves. It is in this distorted reflection that attachment is born. The ego, driven by an unquenchable thirst for power and universal recognition, seeks to subjugate the world around it, as if it were an integral part of itself. Often, by attaching ourselves to a specific person, high social status, or cherished goal, we do so not because of their true value, but because we subconsciously project our inner shortcomings and complexes onto them. the frantic desire for universal love and adoration can manifest in the form of a painful emotional dependence, and the deep-seated fear of being insignificant and unnoticed pushes one to a compulsive obsession with success and recognition. Ultimately, what we mistakenly perceive as genuine love or noble ambition often turns out to be a desperate attempt to fill a gaping inner void. Such projections function like distorted lenses, warping reality. Instead of seeing another person as they truly are, we see only a reflection of our own desires and fantasies. It is here that the root of disappointment and frustration lies, for no one can eternally play an alien role imposed from the outside. Pathological attachment is nothing more than an illusory symbiosis, a false belief that by keeping another person close, gaining their favor, or establishing control over them, we will attain long-awaited wholeness and integrity. However, this completeness turns out to be false and ephemeral, as it depends entirely on external factors beyond our influence. As Carl Jung astutely observed, the psyche, resorting to the mechanism of projection, desperately tries to protect itself from unconscious content that it is not yet ready to accept and integrate. It is much easier to believe that those around us reject and do not accept us than to bravely face our own fear of not being good enough. It is far more convenient to blame the whole world for our inner voids and disappointments than to admit the bitter truth that we ourselves once rejected an important part of ourselves. When the veil of projections falls from our eyes, order reigns in the soul. A person suddenly realizes that their attraction to another was caused not so much by the qualities of that person, but by their own unexplored corners of consciousness. It is at this moment that a magical transformation of reality occurs. The object of passion ceases to be merely a reflection of personal needs, turning into an independent personality with its own inner world. Shedding the shackles of projections is no easy task, but the reward for this work is long-awaited freedom. This is the first step on the path to sincerity with oneself and therefore with the whole world around. Seeing the inflated ego striving to subjugate all that exists, we open the door to conscious presence. The connection with the world is built not on the desire to possess, but on genuine unity. But what happens when projections collapse like a house of cards? The ego, seized with panic, desperately tries to maintain control over an unmanageable situation. It is important to understand that there is a huge gap between a confident movement towards a goal and a maniacal desire to control every aspect of existence. The former is born from inner harmony, the latter from fear, artfully disguised under the guise of competence. Humanity strives to anticipate every turn of fate, carefully planning and seeking to master every aspect of its existence, as if this could guarantee unwavering security. However, in essence, an excessive desire for control is merely a manifestation of the ego, desperately trying to avoid the inevitable uncertainty inherent in life itself. As Jung astutely noted, neurosis is nothing more than a surrogate for genuine suffering. In this context, control acts as a kind of pain reliever. Instead of immersing oneself in the depths of feelings, the mind feverishly develops complex strategies. Instead of facing one's vulnerability, a person hides behind a wall of routine actions, ambitious goals and obsessive promises, as if total control can protect them from the pain that inevitably accompanies human existence. However, it should be remembered that controlling is not the same as living a full life. It is more like being in an artificially created bubble where there is no room for real feelings and experiences. Seeking to eradicate unpredictability, a person involuntarily deprives themselves of spontaneity, and it is precisely this that gives the life experience a unique flavor, freshness, and authenticity. Relationships gradually turn into a soulless mechanism, work becomes an unbearable burden, and everyday life, even filled with many tasks, seems empty and meaningless. The inflated ego, convinced of its omnipotence, believes that it is capable of and should cope with everything in the world. It is it that persistently instills the idea of the existence of the only right way to live, a kind of ideal model to which it is necessary to strive, and any deviation from this imposed pattern causes a painful sense of guilt, paralyzing fear, and merciless self-criticism. The human consciousness, like an overloaded operating system, can fall into a state of overactivity when too many programs are running simultaneously. This state of mental and emotional exhaustion is a natural consequence of such a work regime and not a personal weakness. Deep down, the desire for control is often a protective reaction against the feeling of submission. However, surrendering doesn't mean completely abandoning oneself, but rather acknowledging the existence within us and in the surrounding reality of forces beyond our control. Carl Jung viewed the unconscious as a living, autonomous intelligence, actively participating in shaping reality. By ignoring this dimension, we become trapped in rational logic, naively believing that all problems can be solved solely on the level of thinking. Letting go of control is, in essence, an act of trust, a recognition that wisdom can also be hidden in chaos, and unpredictability can point the right way. This is not a call to aimless existence, but an invitation to open up space for unexpected turns, which rarely happen when we strive to control even the smallest manifestations of life. The stronger our desire for planning and predictability, the further we move away from our own essence. Conversely, by allowing ourselves to listen, observe, and feel, without immediate intervention, we begin to see that life has its own rhythm, and this rhythm unfailingly leads us in the right direction. What if true freedom lies not in total control, but in providing the ego with the opportunity for transformation? This path of self-discovery is a turning point, when the ego, exhausted by fruitless attempts to manage every aspect of existence, begins to loosen its grip and turns to deeper levels of consciousness. The self, in essence, is the core of the psyche, the embodiment of wholeness and completeness of existence. It is not just a social mask or a role we play, but the true essence that manifests when we discard all pretense. Until the ego dominates, life is built around external prescriptions and expectations, how we should behave, how we should look, what others expect of us. Liberation from these imposed ideas marks the beginning of a long journey back to one's true essence. Carl Jung called this process individuation, becoming who one truly is by integrating the conscious and unconscious aspects of personality. This process is not speculative. It begins with small but significant changes in behavior when a person ceases to automatically react according to old, habitual patterns, when they realize that there is no longer any need to maintain a certain role. For example, when a relationship ends, and instead of panicking to find a replacement, a person finds the strength to face the resulting void head-on. These moments of liberation open doors to a new reality, not promising instant comfort, but creating space for the manifestation of authenticity. True surrender begins when the ego recognizes its limitations and realizes that it no longer needs to pretend to be omnipotent and omniscient. In the depths of human existence, something elusive, full of inner dynamics, is born. The self, this essential core of personality, does not resort to intrusiveness or loud statements, but guides a person with gentle but distinct clarity. Its guidance does not stem from the realm of rational logic, but from the depths of inner harmony, from those vibrations that resonate in the soul, filling it with a sense of meaning, even if a rational explanation is not possible. This act of letting go, far from passive inaction, represents a more subtle form of conscious presence. It is an act devoid of obsession with the result, a love that does not require reciprocity, a creativity that does not need proof. In this state, a person is driven not by the need for external approval, but by inner consistency, which does not need applause to confirm its value. In the process of individuation, the ego does not disappear without a trace, but undergoes a transformation of its role. Instead of claiming to possess absolute truth, it begins to serve the interests of the self. This inner change has a profound impact on all aspects of life. Interpersonal relationships become more sincere and authentic, decisions made acquire deep meaning, and life, previously perceived as a battlefield, begins to unfold as an experience that simply needs to be lived. Letting go in this context is not synonymous with loss, but represents integration, a process that allows what must leave to leave and allows what is ready to appear to emerge. In this act, a person ceases to play the role of a character and begins to live as a whole person. Before the self can assert itself in its entirety, it is necessary to shed another protective layer, the persona, as Jung defined it. This term refers to the social mask that each of us wears, striving for recognition in society. The persona plays an important role, since we live in society, but the problem arises when there is excessive identification with this mask. A person begins to live by maintaining the created image rather than expressing their true essence. Striving to appear strong, spiritually developed, successful, or to be a role model, all these labels, while seemingly attractive and worthy, carry serious consequences. The constant need to conform to the created image requires relentless self-control, which leads to exhaustion. But what's worse is that it alienates a person from themselves, as their self cannot fully unfold while under the constant burden of fulfilling a specific role. Jung viewed the persona as a necessary but limited tool, a bridge between the inner world and the outer world. Difficulties begin when a person forgets that there is something more, when the attachment to the image becomes so strong that any threat to its destruction causes fear, anger, and a defensive reaction. In such a situation, a person ceases to live a real life, instead managing the impression they make. Liberation begins with the realization that there is no need to maintain an unchanging image, that it's okay to make mistakes, change beliefs, be contradictory, and not conform to previous ideas. It's important to be sincere with what you feel in the moment. It's from this state that authenticity is born, even if it's not to everyone's taste. Abandoning the imposed image is truly a revolutionary step, requiring considerable courage to appear before the world without protective armor, to allow oneself to be authentic, even if it threatens to destroy an image carefully built over the years. However, this bold gesture brings an unparalleled liberation, like leaving a musty stage of a failed production and taking a deep breath of fresh air, becoming the full author of one's own destiny. As Carl Jung astutely observed, he who looks outside dreams, he who looks inside awakes. Excessive attachment to a created image is nothing more than self-deception, a naive belief that we are only what we show to others. True awakening comes when we dare to look inside ourselves and recognize the complexity and multifaceted nature that no mask, even the most carefully constructed, can contain. It is in this awareness that true, full-blooded life begins. Behind this artificial shell lies what we are most afraid to see, our own shadow. Freedom frightens many, despite the fact that almost everyone desires it. Only a few are willing to meet it face to face, with utmost honesty, because being free means losing the ability to hide behind other people's backs in imposed roles or empty promises. It means taking full responsibility for oneself, including those aspects of one's personality that we would prefer to ignore. This is where the shadow resides. According to Jung, the shadow is the totality of repressed aspects of our psyche, everything that we reject, ignore, or consider unacceptable in ourselves. It is not necessarily evil in its pure form, but rather what has been deliberately hidden from prying eyes because it did not conform to the image of the ideal self we created. The more persistently an individual tries to suppress certain aspects of their personality, the stronger they subtly influence their existence. A subject who declares a desire for independence but at the same time feels a strong attachment often falls into a state of panic in the face of the potential consequences of this freedom, a feeling of emptiness, all-consuming silence, a lack of confirmation of one's own significance. As a result, they desperately cling to another person, professional activity, or idealized ideas about the future, guided not by a feeling of love, but by an irrational fear of what might arise when everything that served as their support disappears. It is at this moment that the process of letting go becomes excruciatingly painful, as it involves not only liberation from external factors, but also a bold look into oneself. What remains when a cherished desire remains unrealized? What arises when a relationship comes to an end? Carefully constructed plans collapse, and the created image crumbles to dust. In this naked space, the shadow manifests itself, and it does so in a very indelicate way. Sometimes it appears in the guise of rage, envy, deep sadness, emotions that a person would prefer not to acknowledge. However, it takes considerable courage to go through this dark tunnel without embellishing reality. As the famous psychoanalyst Carl Jung said, enlightenment is impossible without encountering the dark sides of the soul. It is in this transitional period that the transformation of personality takes place. When an individual ceases to fear their own shadow, it loses its ability to secretly control their life. They begin to integrate these suppressed aspects, needs, fears, vulnerabilities, as integral parts of themselves, not to submit to them, but to control them, not allowing them to dictate their will from the shadows. Letting go of attempts to hold on to another person becomes not just an act of liberation, but also a profound dive into those aspects of oneself that are usually rejected. The shadow side of personality is not an obstacle to a full life, but rather an integral part that must be accepted in order to achieve wholeness. Only those who sincerely explore their inner contradictions can experience the freedom that originates from within themselves. Paradoxically, this shadow often manifests in relationships that are considered to be loving. Often there is a substitution of concepts, and love is confused with an acute need for another person. The line between a sincere desire to be with someone and a panic fear of loneliness can be subtle, but its presence is crucial. Carl Jung argued that true love begins where projections end. As long as a person is fixated on the role another plays in their life, they are unable to see their true essence, or even themselves. In the initial stages of a relationship, it is natural to idealize a partner, which is mistakenly taken for a deep feeling. A person unconsciously projects onto another hopes for emotional salvation, a sense of security, and even a sense of their own identity, thereby creating dependence. As a result, the partner ceases to be perceived as an individual and becomes merely a performer of a specific role. It is at this moment that anxiety appears, disguised as love, but is actually fear, fear of loss, fear of not being good enough, fear of facing oneself. A person needs the constant presence of another to feel comfortable, and their departure causes a feeling of disintegration. However, love, which should unite, is actually just a need. It is not a true connection, but rather a contract based on mutual insecurity. Freedom from the bonds of emotional dependence raises the question, what remains when the need to use another person as protection against one's own dislike disappears? It often happens that sympathy for a person is sincere, but they also serve as a kind of shield, hiding unaccepted aspects of personality. In this context, liberation does not mean the cessation of love, but rather marks the beginning of love in its purest form. This means allowing another person to be themselves without imposing a role on them in one's personal emotional structure. It's about love free from possessiveness, about relationships with a real person, not a projection created by one's own imagination. This approach requires maturity and recognition of the other person's freedom, their ability to change, and even the possibility of leaving. Despite this, they deserve respect and good feelings. This also entails an internal restructuring. Instead of seeking completeness in another person, it is necessary to find support in oneself, a foundation that allows one to love without losing one's own identity. Love, devoid of possessive instincts, is not cold or detached. On the contrary, it becomes deeper and more conscious, as it is not fueled by fear. This is a state of calm and depth, when we does not overshadow I, when people are together, not dissolving into each other, but sharing their integrity. True relationships begin where projections end, imperfect but real. It is a meeting of two minds that do not seek annihilation or fusion, but get to know each other, and therefore allow themselves to love freely. However, maintaining this carefully constructed illusion and the dependence that goes with it comes at a high price, namely the squandering of vital energy. Inevitably, there comes a moment when attempts to keep everything under control fail. The mask created to meet expectations, demands, and accepted patterns begins to crumble. The strength that once seemed limitless turns into an unbearable burden, and the fatigue that was initially perceived as physical reveals its true cause. The ego is depleted like a source that has exhausted itself. This exhaustion is not a manifestation of laziness or weakness, but rather a silent cry of the unconscious, a forced pause, as if an inner voice is desperately calling out, "It is no longer possible to pretend." And it is at this moment that the true self begins to manifest, not in a burst of euphoria, but in a special peace that comes with the completion of something. Carl Jung viewed such breakdowns as a call to sincerity. When inner life becomes unbalanced, it is often a harbinger of an upcoming reorganization at a deeper level. Emotional burnout, so common in the modern world, can be interpreted not only as a result of an excess of external stimuli, but also as an overabundance of social roles, too many expectations, and insufficient alignment with genuine feelings. A life dedicated to maintaining a certain image requires a constant expenditure of energy, carefully weighing every word, emotion, and reaction, constantly monitoring oneself. But when the body refuses to obey, the mind becomes blocked, and the will disappears. Something insistently demands attention. Who are you without all this pretense? At a pivotal moment, the realization of letting go appears not as an escape from reality, but as a genuine liberation from shackles. There comes an understanding that there is no need for an exhausting struggle, for constantly proving one's worth. There is an opportunity to stop, catch one's breath, and not disappear into oblivion. On the contrary, it is at this moment that the true manifestation of personality begins in all its fullness. The ego, imprisoned by fear, fiercely resists this change, fearing that without relentless effort, the world will collapse. However, submitting to a higher will is not capitulation, but a manifestation of a high level of mental intelligence, a recognition of the existence of boundaries that should not be forcibly crossed. Overcoming these boundaries only leads to devastation. Carl Jung, a prominent psychologist, argued that ignoring the needs of the psyche generates painful symptoms, while attentively listening to its voice opens up new avenues for development. The fatigue experienced by a person in their social role is a call to be freed from it, to seek the true meaning of life, to recognize the need for a respite. Before discarding the old, it is necessary to rest, shed the burden of constant performance, and allow something truly one's own to manifest in the resulting space of pause. When the mask of a social role falls, it exposes a pain that few talk about, grief for those opportunities that were never realized. Much is said about letting go as liberation, but little is said about the pain it brings. After all, letting go is also a kind of death, not physical, but symbolic, but no less intense. Abandoning a cherished idea of a relationship, abandoning rosy projections of the future, is an experience of grief for what did not come true, and this grief is quite real and deserves recognition. Carl Jung viewed suffering not as an annoying obstacle to be immediately eliminated, but as an integral part of the process of personal transformation. In his interpretation, suffering is the crucible in which a new essence is forged. Recalling the words of Jesus, one can say that without symbolic death there is no spiritual resurrection. This law applies both to the external circumstances of our lives and to the internal psychological cycles. When a certain stage comes to an end, whether it be an unfulfilled plan, a faded love, or an outdated identity, a painful rupture occurs. Such a parting, even if dictated by necessity, always leaves a mark. Letting go in this context is not just a cold, rational choice, but a deep emotional process that often plunges us into a state of silence and doubt. When that on which our confidence and sense of security were built disappears, a vacuum is created. And although this emptiness has the potential for new growth, it certainly causes fear. During this period, contradictory feelings arise: relief and sadness, a sense of freedom and oppressive loneliness, courage and paralyzing fear. All these are integral components of mental anguish caused not only by the loss itself, but also by the collapse of the image we support, the destruction of the idea of how everything should have been, and the impossibility of implementing the internal scenario. A person's self-esteem suffers, craves explanations, meaning, and awareness of the reasons for failure. However, fate follows a different, more complex, and non-linear logic. Often, unfulfilled dreams and plans push us towards self-analysis, towards a reassessment of life priorities, and towards a revision of the foundations of our worldview. Perhaps this is a signal about the need to abandon the intended path, which has ceased to correspond to our true needs, although it seemed familiar and recognizable. It is important to treat this grief with respect and give it time, but it is also necessary to learn to let it go. Only by going through pain without denying it is a person capable of genuine transformation. It is not about clinging to suffering, but it is also not worth ignoring it. Conscious experience of pain has its own term, and it is during this period that internal maturation occurs. The ability to let go is the art of dealing with invisible losses that leave no visible traces, but deeply wound the soul. And it is in the place of this invisible scar that a new life gradually begins to emerge, not as a promise, but as a potential opportunity. When the bonds that bound us finally weaken, something amazing happens. The world does not collapse, but is rebuilt. The silence that once frightened becomes fertile ground, and the emptiness that inspired fear turns into a space for new beginnings. It is in this new reality that the seeds of what could not come to life while everything was filled with control, expectations, and hustle begin to sprout. It's like opening a window after a long confinement. Dust motes dance in the rays of light, and the air is filled with the freshness of change. At first, there is an unfamiliar sensation, a quiet discomfort, but gradually the breathing recovers, and with it, a sense of presence returns. The mind ceases its chaotic race and begins to listen to the body, to the flow of time, to the subtle signs of life. Imagine a person who has spent many years in a relationship where genuine exchange of feelings has long faded, but who remained in it out of fear of loneliness, strong attachment, or ingrained habit. And when this person finally frees themselves not only from the other, but also from the obsessive illusion that the relationship can still continue, they are overwhelmed by shock, silence, and a sense of emptiness. But immediately after that, an unfilled space appears. And in this free space, they rediscover inspiration for creativity, begin to cook food without any compulsion, feel the need to be alone with themselves, immerse themselves in music in the dark, engage in something that does not need to be shown to anyone. This return to creativity is not as an obligation, but as a way of self-expression. The renowned psychologist Jung spoke of the energy of the psyche that is restored when we stop feeding our ego. All the resources that were previously directed toward maintaining a certain image, controlling the future, or resisting the present become free and demand an outlet. It is then that creativity is born, not only in its artistic manifestation, but also in an existential sense. Creativity is not just creating an artistic canvas or composing a lyrical work. It is a profound transformation of personal existence, filled with conscious presence. It can be rearranging furniture in the house, changing the usual route, or finding a new rhythm of life. It is an alchemical process of turning past suffering into valuable experience and worldly wisdom. The origins of creativity begin where a person ceases to react mechanically to external stimuli and begins to consciously choose their path. This turning point comes only when a certain space, a kind of window of opportunity, arises in the mind. It is in this mental void that intuition gains the power of voice, capable of drowning out the fears and doubts that previously dominated thoughts. A person begins to notice connections between phenomena that previously seemed like insurmountable problems. Inspiration can strike suddenly, for example, while taking a shower, and answers to complex questions come easily and naturally as a reward for days of intense searching and reflection. The creator stops frantically searching for a solution, relying on logic, and begins to trust their feelings to notice fleeting details. Time also undergoes changes. The day ceases to be like a battlefield, filled with stress and struggle. Slowing down the pace of life occurs not because of laziness or apathy, but because of inner harmony and attunement with the surrounding world. Making decisions becomes easier and more natural as the need to prove something to oneself or others disappears. It is noteworthy that goals and dreams that previously seemed unattainable begin to materialize on their own. And this is not about magic or witchcraft, but about the fact that a person has stopped creating obstacles on the path to their success, opening up to new opportunities and perspectives. Imagine a creator constrained by their own ambitions, a person whose excessive demands on themselves and their work paralyze their ability to create. They strive so much for perfection, for creating something brilliant, that they are unable to produce anything at all. And then one day, exhausted, they decide to let go of the situation, temporarily abandon the project, allow themselves a break. They go for a walk, perhaps even go somewhere without a specific plan. And it is there, away from the usual environment and intrusive thoughts, that a new idea is born, spontaneous, full of life, free from pressure and expectations. This is the true power of letting go. When a person is freed from excessive control, what is truly important and valuable either returns to them or finally gets the opportunity to manifest itself. This state of liberated creativity, a deep connection with one's essence, is the complete opposite of the logic of the ego. The ego strives to control everything, craves guarantees of success and immediate results, while the essence of a person seeks only expression, truth, and harmony. When the ego ceases to be the center, the essence naturally and effortlessly takes on the role of the leading force. It doesn't coerce or force, but gently guides, pointing out possible paths, asking nothing in return. It manifests through what brings genuine pleasure, even if unnoticed by others, even if it doesn't bring tangible benefits. It is at this moment that letting go reveals itself in all its glory. It's not just losing something, but rather a transition, a kind of bridge between the past and the future, between who a person was, desperately trying to prove something, and who they really are, when it's enough to simply be themselves. Letting go returns a person to themselves, without excess, without fuss, without the burden of unnecessary obligations and others' expectations. The space that opens up after letting go is not a frightening void, but fertile ground ready to receive the true presence of a person, their true feelings and desires. In this silence of being, where bustle gives way to stillness, life addresses us not with a loud call, but with a quiet whisper of revelations. And only those who have found inner harmony and purity of thought are able to hear this secret dialogue. Ultimately, it all comes down to one single, deeply meaningful gesture: opening the palm, symbolizing freedom from illusions, soul-tormenting fears, and obsessive scenarios of the past. This happens not under the yoke of exhaustion, although it often serves as a starting point, but as a result of newfound clarity. There comes a moment when the burden of holding on becomes unbearable, exceeding the value of the loss itself. Attachment, no matter how familiar it may seem, is not a true expression of love. It grows from the soil of fear, fueled by a sense of lack and the desire to hold on to what is slipping away. True love is giving freedom to exist, allowing life to flow in its own course, even if it goes against personal expectations. Control, contrary to popular belief, is not a sign of strength, but merely a sophisticated form of resistance. It is the ego striving to subjugate reality to its whims. But a life built on such logic turns into an endless series of tense confrontations, a permanent conflict with the present, and no soul can withstand such a test for any length of time. As Jung stated, healing comes not when we forcibly strive for change, but when we accept the existing state of affairs, when we cease the exhausting struggle with life and begin to listen to its wise voice, when we abandon the fruitless pursuit of the ideal and look at reality with an open heart. Acceptance is not surrender, but openness to new opportunities. It is the gate through which true transformation enters. Today, perhaps the most pressing question arises before each person. What are they desperately clinging to? What image, what ideal or unfulfilled expectation still occupies a precious place in their soul, hindering the arrival of fresh winds of change? What will happen if they finally free themselves from these shackles and allow themselves to breathe deeply? Of course, letting go of the past is always a risk, a step into the unknown. However, clinging to the old can be just as dangerous, because often it is being held captive by illusions that turns out to be more destructive than fear of future changes. After all, each of us came into this world not to play an imposed role, but to live authentically. And authentic life, in turn, requires considerable courage. The courage to shed layers that have long outlived their usefulness, the courage to get closer to one's true essence, the courage to allow oneself to simply be oneself. True life begins where the illusion of total control collapses. It is in this quiet and secret point that the return to the true self takes place, not to an imposed ideal, but to a living and real presence. And then everything that really matters will surely find its way.